May 12, 1945, a military truck rolled to a stop outside a small town in Texas. A canvas tarp was folded back, and through the narrow slit, 22 Japanese women leaned forward, their faces a study in exhaustion and expectation. They had been told many things about the enemy, that Americans were weak, decadent, and starving, that the empire was righteous and the other side was frightened and broken. What waited beyond the flap, however, was not the ruin or cruelty they had been prepared for. It was an ordinary American street at midday, and beyond it a storefront with glass doors that opened at the touch of a stranger. When the automatic doors parted, a cool, conditioned breeze brushed their hair. The smell hit them first: citrus, milk, bread, something impossible in the mouths of women who had learned to measure every scrap. In the center of an aisle, piled into a neat orange pyramid, were fruit that in their world had become a myth. They stepped through, and the world that had been narrated to them with conviction and violence began to feel, in one soft sensory assault, decidedly untrue. If this moment surprises you as much as it did them, take a second to like and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Then stay with me. The scene behind that supermarket doorway is at the heart of a story that bends the lines between truth and propaganda, between kindness and disorientation, between what soldiers are taught and what they come to recognize with their own senses. 6 months earlier, in December 1944, Yoko Harada was a nurse in Manila. She had been working endless shifts in makeshift wards, a table where an orderly could not be found, an IV running with saline low in a bottle the nurses all shared. The city itself had been skinned by war. Streets were uncertain territory, and every day demanded a kind of steely improvisation. Supplies that once seemed ordinary, bandages, anesthesia, even soap, were rationed into memory. Yoko's days were threaded through with small, decisive acts: stitching a wound, holding a hand while a patient slept, whispering into a fevered ear that help would come. At night, she and the other women would trade stories about home, about sisters and mothers who sent letters full of coded hope, letters that made the danger sound distant so that the letter writer could keep moving. Propaganda in Japan by then had become a scaffold for endurance. It was everywhere, on posters, in speeches, in private conversations softened by fear. It told a story that was tidy and absolute. The Western enemy was decadent and on the verge of collapse. Sacrifices were a noble currency. To embrace that story meant to turn scarcity into meaning. To doubt it risked losing not just morale, but social identity itself. When Manila fell, Yoko and 21 other women were rounded up. Capture, for many of them, had been imagined in the worst of ways: summary execution, humiliation, a final end.
Instead, the Americans treated them with a formality that felt foreign. There was a basic humanity to the camp procedures: clean bedding, medical checks, the offer of a meal. To the women conditioned to expect only brutality from an enemy labeled immoral, this procedural courtesy generated a different kind of armored shock. It did not erase war or suffering, but it cracked open a question the propaganda had not prepared them to ask. They were embarked on a voyage heading east. Ships carried them under a sky that sometimes seemed impossibly indifferent. On May 8, 1945, VE Day on the other side of the world, though news traveled slowly in the Pacific, the vessel dropped anchor in San Francisco. The city was a display of life intact: streamers, crowds in the streets, stores with lights and windows, people moving through a city not hollowed by blockade or siege. For women who had been told that America was a moral corpse, the sight of a living urban center was another disorienting contradiction. None of it preached, it only existed, and their perceptions registered the fact. From San Francisco, they were moved inland to Seagoville Federal Detention Center, a place Americans called Seagoville, but that in some accounts carried the nickname Seagullville among locals. The barracks were clean, in a manner European poet might call unadorned. Bunks were spaced, sheets were provided, and a table set aside for communal meals. The camp commander, an Oklahoma corporal, whose face the women later described with a mix of reserve and human ordinariness, announced that part of the orientation to life in the camp would include a trip to a local grocery store, a Piggly Wiggly a few miles away. It was meant, in administrative terms, to orient the prisoners to civilian routine, how to buy what you needed with coupons, where to find bread, how the American retail system functioned. It was a practical trip dressed in the clothing of mundane instruction. For Yoko and the others, it provoked something far greater. The doors of the Piggly Wiggly opened like a secret. They unlocked an everyday architecture none of them had been permitted to imagine. First came the cool, conditioned air. It felt like a new temperature layered on fatigue. Then the aisles stretched away, each with a different promise. Shelves stacked with canned goods in neat rows. More varieties of tea and rice than any market in wartime Japan offered. Breakfast cereals that came in boxes with bright graphics. Polished meat counters like altars. Glass bottles of milk, lined like clear trophies in a refrigerator case. And then, in an aisle at the center of the store, a pyramid of oranges, glossy and almost brazenly abundant. Sensory detail matters because this was not an argument to be read, it was a fact to be taken into the mouth, the nose, the skin. One of the women, Fumo, could not take the pressure of it.
She collapsed into a stack of potato sacks, her knees giving out, as if a physical reaction to the revelation itself had exhausted her. Ko, from a town near Hiroshima, did not collapse, but she cried, a sound Yoko later remembered as raw and uncontainable. A young Piggly Wiggly manager, embarrassed and unsure how to handle prisoners of war in his store, hovered near the counter. An American guard, wanting to bridge an unspoken rupture, offered one of the women an orange. They had not come to do harm. They had come because the system that processed prisoners sometimes included small gestures of normality. For the women who had been taught to think of America as hungry and demoralized, the orange was not merely fruit. It was a piece of evidence, a tiny object that weighed more than any speech. Yoko wrote in her diary in a line that later would be excerpted by researchers, "I saw an orange and felt ashamed." Those 3 words, visible and stark, are less a political claim than an account of a private, gnawing dissonance. What happened in that supermarket was not a well-constructed psychological operation. There is no archival instruction manual that broadcasts an American intent to confuse captured Japanese women by displaying abundance. The actions on that day were a sequence of bureaucratic choices, human misreadings, and small courtesies. But for the women, the effect was seismic. The propaganda that had sustained their sacrifices had presented a world in which their rulers were sacrificing for the greater good, and the enemy was decadent. In the aisle of a Texas grocery, the sensory reality contradicted that narrative so directly that allegiance itself began to pull apart. You can imagine how compounding examples, glass bottles full of milk, rows of canned corn, automatic doors that opened for anyone who approached, turned each woman into an investigator of fact rather than a simple recipient of propaganda. That night in Segoville, the barracks buzzed with whispers. The women shared impressions in hushed voices, their words looped into a new architecture of meaning. We were told. No one told us. Yoko scratched a note at the edge of her diary. I ate and did not know how to swallow. The simplest acts of consumption now carried moral freight. Eating an apple, cracking the peel on an orange, drinking milk, each could feel like complicity in a lie. For soldiers and prisoners trained to find purpose in collective belief, this personal embarrassment had the power to unroot certainty. Letters from back home complicated everything with another layer of dissonance. Yoko's sister in Osaka wrote of rationed rice and of neighbors trading clothing just to keep a child warm. The words were familiar, fear wrapped in routines of daily life. The sisters' letters held on to the official narrative out of necessity and perhaps out of protective denial. To admit that propaganda might be false risked the fragile scaffolding of hope on which many families leaned. So the women in Segoville confronted a double world. In the camp, they found tangible abundance. In the letters, they received an echo of scarcity. That echo itself could be evidence of the deception. If the government reported intense hardship at home, why did American stores look so full? The question forced each woman to examine not just what she was seeing, but what she had been asked to sacrifice for. It is tempting in retrospect to imagine a clean line between victims and perpetrators of deception, but history resists such tidy moral diagrams. In the barracks, the women did not simply pivot to hate the country they now saw standing. Many experienced instead a tangled grief. They felt anger toward the leaders and systems that had fed them a narrative, grief for the family members who had gone without because of rationing and who might have died believing the lies, and a curious, partial admiration for the ordinariness of people who could buy bread without pleading for it. One night, Yoko and Ko talked quietly about what the orange meant, not merely as fruit, but as proof, and Ko said, not with fury, but with a kind of exhausted wonder, that the world might be larger and meaner and kinder than they had been led to think. In July 1945, the world learned terms that made the previous months seem like the prologue to a new chapter with an unimaginable pen. On July 16, 1945, an atomic device was tested in the deserts of New Mexico. For the women in Segoville, the news moved like distant thunder. On August 6th and August 9th, the United States dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ko, whose hometown sat near Hiroshima's sphere, reacted with a human sound that cut through the barracks, a scream that was equal parts grief and recognition, a sound reminding everyone that geopolitics lands in villages, in sisters' homes, in the exact coordinates of someone's daily life. The shock was not merely of technology, it was the devastating human consequence of strategy, consequence that multiplied personal loss. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. A nationwide announcement ended a war, but did not end the aftershocks of what the women had seen and realized. Repatriation followed in fits. Ships carried returning citizens and former prisoners through waters that were the same, but that tasted different. When Yoko returned to a home transformed by bomb damage, the skyline of Yokohama torn, families scattered, neighbors gone, she carried with her an orange wrapped in ration paper. It was not an ornamental thing. It was a relic and a test to show someone the truth that had made her feel ashamed in Texas. The orange, once peeled and eaten, vanished into the same digestive economy as all fruit. Yet the memory of it remained sharp. In reunions with her sister in Osaka, the orange became a talisman the way a photograph becomes evidence. Its symbolism, though, was ambivalent. Proof of a living, plentiful enemy, and proof of the double cost of deception, of lives diverted and sacrificed in the name of national narratives. Yoko's life after the war settled into rhythms that outwardly resembled many others of her generation. She became a teacher, a custodian of small responsibilities, and in her free time, a keeper of a diary that tracked not only weather and wartime dates, but the interior weather of conscience. She refused public spectacle. She did not seek fame for her testimony. Yet she kept photographs, a picture of a storefront with an automatic door, a snapshot of a Piggly Wiggly manager standing awkwardly with a white apron, a black and white image of a mountain of oranges. These visual artifacts, paired with her compact diary lines, became a private archive against forgetting. Much later, long after the voice that first wrote in those pages had grown softer with age, her daughter found the book in a trunk. The discovery was less a revelation of sensational detail than a call to memory, a life lived under the pressure of competing truths, and a personal ledger of what it cost to be taught one thing and to see another. There are ethical knots to be unpicked in this story. The supermarket scene is not a comfortable parable with a tidy moral. It resists being simplified into a statement that propaganda is evil and the other side is pure. Rather, it shows how institutions can use narrative to sustain sacrifice, and how, when narratives collide with the sensory world, the human fallout is complex. Many of the people who administered the camps were not architects of propaganda. They were clerks, corporals, store managers, people doing practical work amid massive historical forces. Their small acts of courtesy felt like gifts to some and betrayals to others. The women who had marched, served, and stitched wounds were not mere victims of their own gullibility. They were actors in a system that demanded loyalty and punished doubt. Their feelings of shame and guilt were real and painful. Their recognition that a world could be different did not resolve that pain. When we return to the phrase in our title, the shocking truth about Japanese POW women and a Texas supermarket, the shock is not a lurid reveal so much as a realignment of understanding. The truth at the center of this story is multifaceted. Truth as sensory evidence, an orange, a glass milk bottle. Truth as personal reckoning, the diary line, "I saw an orange and felt ashamed." And truth as the expensive human consequence of national narratives. The Texas supermarket did not invent the lie. It merely, by its ordinary abundance, contradicted the story that had justified so much sacrifice. In that contradiction, the prisoners encountered a moral and psychological fissure that would mark the rest of their lives.
We owe care to the specifics when we tell this story. The supermarket was a Piggly Wiggly near Segaville. The women were captured in Manila in December 1944. They arrived in San Francisco in early May 1945 and were taken inland to Segaville for processing. Names matter. Yoko Harada is the thread we follow. Fumo collapsed in the aisle. Ko from near Hiroshima voiced a grief that echoed through the barracks. These are not traumatic inventions, but human details recorded in diaries and testimonies. They tether the narrative to the lived experience of people who navigated the terrible collision between ideology and sensory fact. There is also a moral ambiguity to the American side of the ledger. The kindness shown, a cold drink, a piece of fruit, was not a performance of cruelty. It was often the work of people who, within their own moral world, acted with decency. Yet, kindness can have consequences that are unintended. It can unsettle beliefs that sustain identity and force a confrontation with the possibility that entire belief systems are constructed rather than eternal. That dissonance can lead to shame, to anger at leaders, to grief for lives lost under a false premise. The orange that Yoko saved, wrapped and carried like an evidence bag of a different sort, is emblematic in another way. Objects bear witness not by themselves, but by the stories we attach to them. An orange in wartime Japan could mean luxury, rarity, the memory of a festival. In Segaville, the orange was evidence that contradicted a propaganda map. At home, it became an object of explanation and eventually education.
Yoko kept her diary and a photo of the supermarket, not because she wanted to be famous, but because she felt obliged to memorialize a truth she had discovered with the simple crudity of her senses. The arc of these women's feelings illustrates something larger: how nations deploy narrative to forge unity and endurance, and how those narratives, once contradicted, can leave human discomfort that does not immediately resolve. The psychological rupture was matched by physical loss. Families had already paid in lowered rations, in destroyed neighborhoods, in the deaths that attend total war. When the bombs fell, the cost was measured in new, unspeakable units. Returning prisoners carried with them not only the scars of capture, but the burden of reconciling what they had seen with what they had been taught. By the time Yoko's daughter found the diary, the world had shifted into other conversations about memorials and reconciliation, about the ways that ordinary citizens remember and narrate national history. The daughter read the lines and saw the photographs and understood that the story her mother told was not an apologia, but a fragmentary witness. It invited questions rather than answers. It asked the reader to consider, what does it mean when an entire moral architecture collapses in the face of a small, undeniable fact? How do we honor the people who lived within that architecture, who made sacrifices that may have been grounded in partial truths? How do we hold accountable those institutions that told stories without acknowledging the human cost of their certainty? As we end, there is a quiet lesson here that ties back to the title's promise of shock. The most jarring truth in this episode is not an accusation toward whole peoples or a simplistic moral. It is the reminder that everyday abundance, a supermarket aisle, a pyramid of oranges, a bottle of milk, can function as a corrective to dangerous myth-making. Small, factual, sensory moments have the power to puncture ideological certainty in a way that arguments rarely do. That is the shock. It is also the possibility for repair. Facts encountered by a person's own senses can open the door to accountability, to grief, and to a different kind of truth-telling. We must remember Yoko, Fumo, Ko, and the others not as evidence in a case, but as people who navigated a world where sensory fact and official narrative came into painful collision. Their diaries, their quiet conversations, their preserved photograph of an ordinary grocery store are invitations to remember complexity. They teach us that propaganda's human cost is counted not only in statistics, but in the private shames, the ruptured loyalties, the conversations across a barracks table at night. If this story moved you, check the description for sources and archival links. Share it with someone who cares about history's human edge. And when you next push through an automatic door, smell citrus in an aisle, or lift a glass bottle of milk from a chilled case, take a moment to think of how small facts can sometimes hold the weight of history. The supermarket in Texas did not resolve a war. It did, however, put an ordinary piece of evidence into the hands of women whose lives were shaped by story, and in doing so, it changed the way at least some of them would remember the truth.